What's up, everybody? Mr. Smith here. In this video, we are going to start talking about the voting theory unit in discrete math. This unit is going to take us through 4 particular methods of voting that we see around the world and also in our own country for various things. We're going to look at one of them in particular in this video, but before we start that, I just want you to know that the big question that we are trying to answer over the course of this unit is this question right here. What makes an election fair? We could talk all about how elections are run, what it takes to count votes, what that means, how a winner is determined, and all the ins and outs and technicalities of that. But the question I really want us to get at over the course of this unit is what really makes it fair? In the past, when I've taught this class, here are some of the things that students always answer that question with. Everybody's voice should matter for an election to be fair. Totally makes sense. Each vote should be equal. So like your vote should not be any more significant than my vote, otherwise that wouldn't be fair. And students have also said this, that the majority of voters should approve of the winner. It wouldn't make sense to have a winner of an election if a fraction of the voters actually want them to rule. That just wouldn't make any sense. So we're going to try to flush out this question as we move along this unit about what makes an election truly fair. Okay, so let's move on from that. Keep that in mind, but let's move on from that and talk about one particular method of voting. So let's consider an example. All right, we've got this election between these 3 candidates. Sorry that it looks super weird. These are the only pictures that I could use on this program that I'm using. So we got candidate A, candidate B, candidate C, and they are running for some public office, let's say. And after the voting is held, okay, we're in the election and it's election day, voting is held, and let's say this is how the polls turn out. We have 35% of voters going for A, 45% voting for B, and 20% voting for C. I probably would have voted for C on account of this awesome hat, but nobody else agreed with me. So 20% vote for C. The question I want you to think about is, who wins this election? Who do you think should win this election and why? And I would guess that most of you would say that B wins this election because they have the most votes. They have 45% of the votes, and that's more than the other 2 candidates. So logically, it makes sense that B would win this election because they have the most votes, more than anybody else in the race. And this is a perfect example of our first method of voting, which is called plurality, okay? Plurality means that whoever has the most first place votes wins the election. This is a real method of holding an election. Whoever has the most first place votes wins, okay? You might also hear this called first past the post voting. Turns out that a lot of public offices in the United States are actually determined by plurality. Pretty much every one other than the president is determined by plurality. Whoever has the most votes wins the election. Okay, so this is the first one that we're discussing in this video. Let's jump to another example. This table that I'm showing you is something that we call a preference schedule. Preference schedule. This is simply a way to visualize the results of an election. Okay, so now this is a new election. We're not talking about these 3 anymore. Let's say we're talking about a new election and we have candidates A, B, C, and D. And let's say they're running for student council. Okay, we'll just say they're running for student council president. All right. This is how you can read this. First choice. If I scan across this row, this is telling me how many people voted for each candidate as a first choice vote. So this means that 4 people had B as their first place vote. 10 people had C. 1 other person also had C. So that means that C has 11 first place votes total. Okay, so you can kind of see how a preference schedule works. It's just a way of visualizing how people cast their vote. All right. So I want you to ask yourself the same question, except let's think about it in terms of plurality. Remember, plurality means that you have the most first place votes, or you have more first place votes than everybody else. Which candidate, A, B, or C, or D, would win this election based on plurality, aka which candidate has the most first place votes? Turns out that if we just count them up, A has the most first place votes with 14. C has 11, D has 8, and B has 4. A has the most with 14. So that means that by plurality, A would win this election because they have the most first place votes. Okay, so let's say that that's how this goes, and candidate A wins student council president with 14 first place votes. But it turns out that lots of voters are upset by this. When this comes up, lots of voters are really, really angry that A won. So I'm going to show you this preference schedule again, and I want you to think to yourself and consider, why would lots of voters be upset by A winning the election? The reason for that might be most clearly seen if we focus our attention down to the fourth place or the last place row, where you can see that A actually has the most last place votes, just as they have the most first place votes. In fact, they have a lot of last place votes. They have 10 plus 8 plus 4 plus 1, which is 18, 24, 25 last place votes. That means 25 people said they wanted A dead last. They really don't want A. They would have anybody else win other than A. That's why people are upset, because A has the most last place votes. Many of the voters, 25 in fact, do not like A. But if we're both going off of plurality, A would win this election with 14 first place votes, despite the fact that 25 people voted for them in last place. Okay? This is a good example of the fact that plurality is not a perfect method of voting. Even though it makes sense, whoever has the most first place votes should win, it's not always perfect. And it does not always guarantee that everybody is satisfied. Okay? Because something like this may happen where a candidate wins, but they have a lot of last place votes as well. Okay? So let's look at one more thing. We'll shift our attention to something called a fairness criteria. So this is not a way of holding an election. A fairness criteria is simply something that helps us tell if an election is fair. Remember, that's our big question. Is it fair? What does it take to be fair? How can we deem an election fair? Fairness criteria helps us to determine that. It's kind of like a gut feeling about whether or not the election is fair. The first one that we're going to look at, the first fairness criteria, is something called the majority rule. And you're all familiar with what this is. It's the idea that if a candidate has a majority of the votes, meaning at least 50% or at least half of the votes going towards a certain candidate, they should win the election. And I say that they should win because they don't always win they don't always win if they have a majority of the votes. Okay? So let's take this last example, for instance. In this student council election, these numbers up here represent all the people that voted, okay? So all we need to do to determine the total number of people that voted is just add up these numbers. If you add them up, you get 37. So there are 37 people that voted in this election. So let's think about what it would mean to have a majority of people. That means half. You would need half of these 37 voters to vote for you to have a majority, okay? So we need to do 37 divided by 2, which gets me 18 and a half. But since we're talking about physical people and votes, we can't have half of a vote. So we need to round that up to ensure that we would get the correct amount. That means I need 19 votes to have a majority in this election. For a majority of the people to agree with a candidate, 19 of the voters would need to say they want one candidate. Well, if we go back and look at this preference schedule, a majority certainly did not agree on one candidate. A won the election, but they only have 14 votes. A wins with 14 votes. That's much less, relatively, is less than the 19 votes needed for a majority. So they do not have a majority of people voting for them. But underneath the plurality, they have more votes than everybody else. So they would win this election if we're determining it based off of plurality, despite the fact that they do not have a majority. In fact, if you consider it, the only place where we see a majority is for the last place votes for A. 25 people further than a majority voted for A in last place. So the only place we see a majority of people agreeing on something is that they really don't like A. But like I said, under a plurality, A would win this election. Okay? So this is an example of the fact that plurality does not satisfy the majority criterion. Majority criterion. And all that means is that under plurality, you could have a winner that does not have 50% of the votes. Okay, I'll write that down so that you can see it. All this means is that under plurality, a winner of an election does not need 50% or half of the votes. You can win an election under plurality without having a majority of the people voting for you. Okay? Let me show you an example of this. This comes up in real life. Let me show you an example of this that's actually very recent. These are the results of the Democratic presidential primary in our state, in Colorado, earlier this year. Bernie Sanders won our state with 37% of the vote. Okay, Joe Biden was in second with 24%, almost 25%. The crazy thing about this, though, is that 37% means that 63% of people voted for somebody other than Bernie Sanders. Yet he won the presidential primary in our state. And that's strange. That's strange. Based on the fairness criteria, our gut might say, oh, I don't really know about that. But this is how many elections in our country are held, on a first past the post voting method. Okay? So this is a brief description of the plurality method. I hope that it was helpful. I hope it made sense. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me, okay? We'll see you guys soon.